So without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce our guest this evening, Nabila Ramdani, French journalist and the author of Fixing France. Thank you so much for joining us at the Trouble Club.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Ellie.
It's an absolute pleasure, and I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's so kind of you all to come along this evening, and thank you very much for having me in this absolutely stunning venue. I couldn't agree anymore. I have to say, it's actually pretty moving for a French-Algerian like me to be discussing my new book about modern France in the Trouble Club. French establishment figures frequently refer to people like me as trouble, and this has certainly happened a lot since my book came out. And in fact, it got me into so much trouble that I'm a bit worried they won't let me back on the Eurostar when I try to get back to Paris. But Soho has always been a key reception area for successive waves of dissenting exiles from France, including plenty of authors such as Émile Zola and indeed Voltaire, who lived around the corner on Covent Garden. And the title of my book is Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic. So it clearly follows in that tradition. Gallic dissidents moved to London because it was noted for its tolerance and its freedom of expression, and because Britain was always home of the great, it was always one of the great immigrant nations, to put it simply. And it might annoy a few people for me to say that, but it's absolutely true. French migration to London has always reflected French politics, from the persecution of the Huguenots in the 16th century to royalists and Catholic clergy escaping the guillotine in the 1789 revolution. Then there were anarchists who had to get away following the destruction of the Paris Commune in 1871, and of course the Second World War, exiles who included General Charles de Gaulle himself. The Free French were all over Greek Street, especially in l'Escargot restaurant, a few doors along from here. A great Francophile whom I always associate with central London is Mary Wollstonecraft. This magnificent 18th century writer features prominently in my book, not least of all because of the way she attacked the 1789 revolutionaries for failing to take up the cause of female emancipation. It is said that well-behaved women seldom make history, and I think that's absolutely true. And the very troublesome Mary Wollstonecraft would have loved the Trouble Club. Wollstonecraft traveled across the English Channel to see the biggest historical event of her life and how it might have advanced gender equality, and was originally very impressed by a daring social experiment. She even thought it might be repeated in Britain. But it soon became clear to her that women were excluded from the so-called universal Republican ideology. And the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen only applied to men over 25 who paid an appropriate amount of tax, for example. And it is such injustices that prompted Wollstonecraft to write A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is an extraordinarily radical work of literature that argued, and I quote, "It is time to effect a revolution in female manners, time to restore to them their lost dignity and make them as a part of the human species, labor by reforming themselves to reform the world." Great historical figures such as Wollstonecraft and exiles to London such as de Gaulle are discussed at length in my book, but I also focus on less celebrated immigrants, particularly persecuted Algerians who were displaced from France and indeed from France's African empire during the Algerian War of Independence. This group of people is given great importance in my book, not least of all because the horrifically violent conflict between Algerian nationalists and French colonizers literally brought the Fifth Republic, which is the current iteration of Republican France, into being. France was on the verge of civil war in the late 1950s. French nationalists wanted to hang on to Algeria, the jewel in France's imperial crown, while millions of others, not least of all Algerian nationalists, said it should be liberated. Hence, de Gaulle, the Second World War hero, coming out of the wilderness to create a new republic presided over by a king-like alpha male with incredible powers. And it is this kind of presidential government which continues to this day, with Emmanuel Macron pretty much doing what he wants. He can bypass parliament and rule by decree. He can choose his prime minister. He can appoint his cabinet ministers. And they don't even have to be elected politicians. They can be cronies too. He has a massive security state behind him, and many of the paramilitary units within the security apparatus were originally designed to clamp down on unruly Algerians, and prejudice against them still continues. My North African background certainly excludes me from France's national story. I was born in France to Algerian parents. I was educated in Paris. I have a French passport. I can think in French. Being French is very much a mode of thought and indeed expression. Yet there are many French people who do not acknowledge that I am French because of my origins, because of my appearance, and many people like me are literally pushed into lives on the periphery. Worse than that, we are often stigmatized and portrayed in all kinds of unpleasant ways. And my early views of the French Republic, before I got to meet power players such as Emmanuel Macron, were from one of the neglected suburbs of Paris. And accordingly, my first memories are of concrete residential blocks. I make such points very strongly in my book, but fear not, Fixing France is by no means a misery memoir, nor a series of complaints. And in fact, the book is ultimately a call for change. And in that sense, it's very positive and at times pretty optimistic. I'd love another Belle Époque, if only for the Art Nouveau and the Impressionist paintings. My book, in fact, analyzes lots of key subjects. Politics is, of course, clearly crucial, but there are 10 themes explored in 10 chapters, and they include economic injustice, segregated suburbs, the state of French feminism and the debasement of women, terrorism, institutionalized rioting and paramilitary policing, deep-seated racial and religious discrimination, and the rise of the far right as exemplified by Le Pen and her political party, her dynastic party even. In other words, my book doesn't shy away from very difficult issues. And I know that sometimes discussing those issues can cause immense pain and anguish for many, as well as, division and discord. But the easy option is always to avoid getting involved. But I really think that we all owe to the world to try and join the debate and indeed try to make a difference. And that's really the purpose of my book. I've tried to make my book as honest as possible and to write it in a way that will appeal to anybody, no matter what their background. The state of feminism anywhere is always a good barometer of a country's fortunes. And the subject, quite rightly, gets a whole chapter in my book, and indeed features all over it. women's rights have developed extremely slowly in France, despite successive revolutions. And as Mary Wollstonecraft soon discovered, the country's expertise at overthrowing rulers in 1789 certainly didn't extend to defeating the patriarchal system. And this was despite Marianne, a female incarnation of freedom, coming to symbolize the Republic. This fantasy figure was given the most popular girls' names of the late 18th century, Mary and Anne, and was not afraid of taking to the barricades. The most famous version of Marianne is in Liberty Leading the People, the painting of the romantic artist Eugène Delacroix, which is now in the Louvre. Marianne is waving the tricolour flag and holding a musket with a fixed bayonet during the Revolution of July 1830. And she now takes pride of place in most buildings across France. There are depictions and sculptures of her bust in law courts, prefectures, city halls, and she's also on the official government logo and indeed on stamps. Up until 1969, the identity of this superwoman was deliberately kept mysterious. Anonymity created an aura of universalism in line with France's values. But then President de Gaulle approved a sculpting workshop in the Louvre, turning international sex symbol Brigitte Bardot into the national image. De Gaulle had met Bardot at a dinner once at the Élysée Palace at the end of 1967. Bardot ostensibly united the country, north and south, because she was a Parisienne who had spent all her summer holidays with her prosperous parents on the Riviera in Saint-Tropez and La Baule. And the press portrayed Bibi, as she became known, as a blonde bombshell rival to Marilyn Monroe, as well as the personification of French womanhood. How unfortunate, then, that Bibi now has multiple convictions for racism and a record of mocking women who complain about sexual harassment. She particularly detests Muslims who want, and she wants to see foreigners deported. Bibi has also been reprimanded for insulting members of the LGBT community. Bibi, older and nastier, might certainly still qualify as a Marianne bust. She epitomizes a country with a far from impressive gender equality record, and one in which thousands of complaints about sexual violence are made every year. Police reported a 10% increase in the number of domestic attacks in 2020, with 159,400 victims. 87% of them, or 139,200, were women. Bardot is a National Rally voter. The party was formerly known as the National Front and was founded by Jean-Marie Le Pen, a convicted racist and an anti-Semite. Bardot has watched the success of the far right increase in line with attacks on women, especially Muslim ones. Patriarchal structures remain very strong indeed in France, particularly in politics, and there can be as many votes in sexism as there are in racism. There has never been a female president in France, and only 2 distinctly low-key women have ever been prime minister. Edith Cresson resigned in April 1992 after a disastrous 10 months and 18 days in the job. 30 years later, Elizabeth Bourne was appointed, and she's rightly referred to as a Macron puppet. Meanwhile, France's obsession with its own brand of secularism, and indeed an often absurd form of feminism, oppresses a huge section of the population. And these include Muslim women who are literally criminalized for their choice of clothing. The great contradiction in French feminism discourse, whether it's argued by the left or indeed the right, is that it uses laïcité or secularism as a tool to allegedly protect and emancipate women from supposedly repressive males, while also stigmatizing and penalizing those same women. There are plenty of perfectly liberated French Muslim women who choose to wear headscarves or indeed modest clothing, and yet they are branded as victims of an oppressive culture and religion. And so it is that France excludes female citizens from public spaces because of their clothes, using fines and the threats of prison to enforce its diktats. The battles for women's liberté and égalité were often won in a stuttering, unsatisfactory manner. French women got the vote in 1944, but the indigenous Muslim women of French-Algeria, as these citizens who were considered second class were called, did not get it until 1958. "Follow your dreams," said Elizabeth Borne when Macron appointed her prime minister in 2022. "Nothing must slow down the struggle for women to be prominent in society," she added. But there were no references to structural or indeed cultural problems. The implication was that women merely lacked ambition. Edith Cresson, who was France's first ever female prime minister, was 88 by this time, and she was quick to highlight how sexist the Republic still was. When it became clear that Macron was going to hand the prime minister's office home to a woman, she said, "It's not the country that is macho, it is its political class. There were the same attacks as there are today. I was under permanent criticism. They commented on my dress. We would never allow the same thing, the same comments on the dress of male politicians. When we talk about women, we talk without embarrassment about their clothes or their appearance." And she concluded, "The post of prime minister is a very difficult position in any case. And then if the difficulties are increased by the fact that the head of government is a woman, it complicates the political situation even more. If a woman were to be appointed again, I will not give any advice. I simply tell her that she will need a lot of courage." In a nutshell, the clearest message I'd like to offer you tonight about my book is that it highlights a whole host of fault lines like these ones as far as France is concerned. But I also point to plenty of solutions. It's a very straightforward read. It is not a stodgy academic book. It is not a political manifesto. In fact, it just highlights my real life experiences and indeed why the modern republic is failing to live up to its own once exalted reputation of liberty, equality and fraternity for all. So I really do hope that you'll enjoy it, and I would like to thank you again for coming tonight and supporting me.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for presenting your book in such a fantastic light. It's so true. I found it to be so fascinating to read. It was so brilliantly written, and it definitely, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm similar to other Brits, but I'd be quite keen to get a kind of poll. So put your hand up if you kind of had idealized France, especially its social, its benefit system, its kind of maybe free medicine. We hear about universal free childcare. Put your hand up if overall you thought that France maybe was doing better than us when it came to progress. Put your hand up. Okay. Put your hand up if you kind of thought maybe they were on par with us here in the UK. Okay. And then put your hand up if you thought maybe they were doing worse than we are in the UK. That's not a hand, by the way. I mean, it's a hand. This is a hand. Undecided is good. You can go for the one in the middle. Because I have to say, I do a lot of these events, which is it's phenomenal. But most of the time, I'm sitting here with a British speaker, and usually we're down on the UK. You're saying this is what's terrible. This is what needs to change. It's very interesting to hear points at where you say, actually, this is something the UK's doing better than us here in France. It's not something that I'm used to hearing a lot of. So would you say that there are certain things? Do you think maybe that there's a perception here in the UK that things are kind of similar or much better in France, when actually that probably maybe isn't the case in some areas?
Well, I have to say that France is a country of illusions. I mean, de Gaulle called it a perpetual illusion himself. And it's very true that when I speak to foreigners, including in Britain, America, or indeed anywhere around the world, the heartwarming old myths about France still prevail. It's a country that's very much associated with, a beautiful, romantic landscapes where people can retreat in the rural areas or enjoy the beautiful coastlines and indeed the wonderful mountains. And there's a sense that you will meet interesting and glamorous people that you can hardly communicate with. And yes, there is the old myth about, the jokes about the unhelpful French. But generally speaking, I think in the public perception, it remains a country that is viewed as rather quaint and antiquated. And it is very true to a certain extent. There's a reason why it remains the country that is the most visited in the world. It attracts people from around the world. But I would say that my book attempts to debunk these myths about the country in the sense that, it's founded on wonderful ideals. Who can argue with liberty, equality, and fraternity for all, for example?
I could argue with fraternity. I would say we could be more gender neutral than that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that feminized society in general, in the sense that when you can get more women in position of powers, could be a lot more effective and a lot fairer. It would certainly avoid a number of wars, I would contend. But I think what I've tried to achieve based on my life experiences, not only as someone who grew up on a housing estate, as someone who is from Arab background, of Muslim background, of immigrant background, a former prime minister of France referred to these suburbs as being a social, economic, and territorial apartheid. They're literally stuck on the periphery of major cities. And in that sense, I am particularly well placed to look at the fault lines of France, not least of all because of my Algerian background, as I've hinted at. The Fifth Republic, the modern French Republic, was literally emerged out of the Algerian War of Independence. And so Algerians were seen as, the enemy within then, and they are still very much perceived as such today. But it's, the fault lines of France extend to all sorts of categories of people. We regularly see how much economic injustice there is in France. On paper, it's a wonderful country, but in fact, there is a lot of social injustice and indeed economic inequality, and that's why you frequently have people taking to the streets, from the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movements, to people who oppose pension reforms. And there's not a sense, it's a sense that's very much anchored in reality, that the French establishment looks after the elite. And Macron very much represents that elite. And he's not doing very much for the riches of France to trickle down. And therefore, there's always a sense of agitation. And as you might have noticed, taking to the streets is one of, France's main pastime. It's proving not very effective, dare I say. And I would contend it's because the system of governance itself is designed to keep people like Macron and his like in place. Again, it's the Algerian War of Independence that gave birth to a system of governments whereby you have a quasi-monarch ruling the country, where the president can ignore parliament and push through legislation at his will. And therefore it makes it a very difficult country to reform, where I argue in my book that seeing a return to a healthy parliamentary democracy would benefit France, not least of all because it would be, a more democratic way of ruling. MPs are there for a reason. They are representatives of the people. But currently, they are denied doing that job because of how France works intrinsically.
And I definitely want to come back to the presidency and to Macron as well. But I did, because you mentioned there your upbringing in the suburbs of Paris and the chapter on the cities, is that how?
Mm-hmm,
cities?
The city.
Which are, as you say, these places that are incredibly impoverished. That, there is an apartheid, as you said. Some people say that there's an apartheid, almost comparing that to the glamorous bits of Paris that we see when we rock up for our holidays. I didn't really realize, or that it was quite a revelation reading about how militarized and how tight security is in these places, whereby the police almost act like a military. There are checkpoints. I mean, this is not something that you hear about very often when talking about France.
Yes, absolutely. And again, you would associate this militaristic tradition more with countries like Germany, for example, or the USA, but France is not far off. And again, it all goes back to the Algerian War of Independence. Most of the paramilitary units that you see operating in France now are quelling the dissents. I mean, it's quite chilling in a way to see those RoboCop types, spraying tear gas and using baton charges, cannon charges against protesters who were there to make a political point, really. And often, things are being triggered because protesters are being antagonized by the forces of law and order. I mean, one thing that strikes me, for example, is that tear gas, it's actually a chemical weapon that's banned in war zones, and yet it's allowed in major cities to be used indiscriminately against men, women, children, the elderly in protests. And this paramilitary or military tradition goes back to the Algerian War of Independence. Some of those units were in fact created during at the height of the Algerian War in the 1950s to keep Algerian nationalists in check. Not just in Algeria, which was actually considered part of mainland France. It was not a typical colony in that respect. It was very much seen as an extension of the French territory, but also on mainland France itself. There were quite sinister massacres taking place. To quote one, on the 17th of October 1961, when Algerians living in France took part in protests in central Paris to ask for independence from France. They took part in peaceful demonstrations in the hundreds to make that point, and they were met with absolutely lethal force, and it ended up with up to 300 people being massacred in central Paris, thrown off bridges on the Seine rivers where they were left to drown with corpses floating for days in the river. Many were killed in police stations or hung from trees. It's, you know, you would not think that these kind of things would happen in living memories. We're talking about the 1960s after all. And therefore, one of the things I argue in my book is that France could do with reforming its policing. I think it could do with more neighboring policing, working with those communities, having a better relation with those communities, and to do a more effective job at policing these areas. So that's, you know, quite that's a legacy that certainly needs changing.
Absolutely, and because you mentioned at one point, because you touched on the tear gas there, you've been gassed yourself.
I have.
Yeah. And you mentioned, I think, at one point your worst gassing. I was like, gosh, how many gassings does one need to have before you have a worst one?
It's actually a terrifying experience because, you know, the French are not very honest about the level of concentration of gas in those canisters. There have been lots of reports by human rights organizations actually, you know, warning France about its use of tear gas in such a concentrated manner. And it has led to people dying, or elderly people choking on gas, but also toddlers who were left in a bad way because they just happened to be there and caught some, whiffs of it. So certainly, I think it's also a reflection of how French society's, dare I say, is out of touch with its democratic tradition. I don't think in this day and age legitimate protest should be met in this manner. And I mean, I've been covering recently demonstrations, pro-Palestine demonstrations in relation to what's happening in the Middle East. And one of the staggering things is that the French government has actually tried to ban, in some cases banned and then authorized those demonstrations. So the idea is, if you disagree with the message, then you ban the demonstrations. So that's also, you know, very unnerving. And you think, you know, what else would they disagree with? And they can ban. So, you know, there is something that is, I mean, there is certainly a deficit, a democratic deficit in France that needs fixing urgently.
And I will come back to you because I want to ask about because I didn't realize that, I mean, we've had pro-Palestinian marches be called a lot of things here in London, but they are at least allowed to take place, whereas I believe they're illegal at the moment in France. But before I do, I was quite shocked to read that in France, the government has no data on race at all. So whether that be employment stats or, you know, school education, things like that, that no one's allowed to take any stats about race, and obviously you can't fix a problem unless you have data on the problem to begin with. So that's quite shocking.
Yes, indeed. And, you know, again, the ideals upon which the French Republic was built are quite noble because technically everybody is equal before the law and, you know, therefore there shouldn't be any problems. And the color of your skin, your race and religion do not matter. Technically, except they do matter when people want to discriminate against you. So unless you have an effective system of measuring, you know, the level of discrimination, including data in relation to discrimination related to race or religion, you know, as you quite rightly said, and it's common sense, if you can't diagnose a problem, then you cannot deal with it, you cannot fix it. And France has refused to collect data, official data, in relation to this. It looks at it as if it was a quirky import from Anglo-Saxon countries, and they certainly do not want to go down the British way, or let alone, God forbid, the American way. But actually, it's not about looking at other models of society. It's literally looking at France's own model and living up to its own motto. and using its own legislation. There's ample legislation against discrimination in all walks of life, but it's not being implemented. And it's definitely driven by agenda-led politicians. France is increasingly veering to the far right, which is becoming mainstream. Marine Le Pen, who's head of the Rassemblement National, formerly the National Front, she's been a runner-up to become president of France twice in a row now, and it could well be that she ends up being president of France the next time around. But certainly her ideas are very much mainstream already. So if we don't take these problems very seriously, then, I would say that the people from my background will keep getting a much harder time.
I'm glad you mentioned Marine Le Pen. You've met her, of course.
I have indeed.
Yeah. What was she like? Was she? Could you? I mean, did she come across? I think you met her back in the early 2000s. Could you kind of see what she kind of became eventually? Well,
I have, in fact, met her and her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who is the founder of the National Front. It has to be said, and it's not an aside at all, it's actually a very important point when you mention the National Front. It's important to bear in mind, and I find this lacking in most of reports or indeed articles you read about the National Front in France, or in the international press as well, that it was literally founded by members of the Waffen-SS who literally were collaborating with Nazi Germany and were members of the Waffen-SS, and there was also it was also founded by the French milice, members of the collaborationist French during the Second World War, of the part of the Vichy government. So that's, and this legacy is still very much there. When I met Marine Le Pen for the first time, she was campaigning on behalf of her father, who was standing for president. And it was quite an interesting meeting. I have to say that the father is quite an impressive politician, in the sense that, he's got charisma, and a lot of it. I met him in the south of France, in Marseille, where the National Front polls very well indeed, does very well. And he was on a stage. He was already quite elderly at the time, but you wouldn't see any of this translating into his behavior. He was on stage, I was going to say almost like on a ring, behaving like a boxer, not pulling any punches, and he was just a performer, that's the word. And I was there to cover the event for the British press, and I sat next to his then wife, and I asked her if I could have an interview with him, and she literally grabbed me by the hand, and she said, yes, you'll speak to him. And he spoke to me exclusively. He turned down any other interview, and he took me to his green room, and he gave me plenty of time. And I asked as many questions as I wanted, but the replies invariably turned around immigration. So that was the salient point he has to make all the time. He congratulated me on my French. I reminded him that I was French-born, and he repeated the compliment. But I have to say that Jean-Marie Le Pen, as far as the French media is concerned, he was always treated as a pariah. He was never brought back in the mainstream. He was somebody with convictions of anti-Semitism, all sorts of unpleasant things he keeps saying about ethnic and religious groups, that he carries as a badge of honor. But Marine Le Pen, she has tried to revamp the party. she has tried to distance herself from her father's legacy. And I would contend that it's a stage schism. She's very much a chip of the old block, not just because the physical appearance is striking. She tried to introduce diversity in the party. For a start, she tried to recruit me.
Did she succeed?
Oh, no, thank you very much indeed. But she, she's still very much, she was married 3 times. So she had plenty of opportunities to change her last name. But Le Pen is the trademark. And that's, tells us a lot about how she still, is very much in her father's footsteps. She still receives an awful lot of money from her father, who funds her party. At the last round of presidential election, she even said that if she won the election, the first thing she'd do is she'd bring daddy to the Élysée Palace. So it doesn't strike me as somebody who's, distant from her father. And her party members are regularly caught up in scandals associated with anti-Semitism and indeed comments, all sorts of unsavory comments about ethnic and religious groups. But she, on a personal level, I think she's very much, she's not a delicate plant at all. She spends a lot of time canvassing. She strikes me as somebody who would go to, neighborhoods, knock on doors. I've seen her do that and hang out with the lads as well. Very much thuggish in her attitude, dare I say. But not intellectually at her finest. She's actually, for example, economically illiterate. She doesn't have any economic plan. She doesn't have any plans or visions for society. And she keeps going on and on about, the cost of living, the price of peas, and that kind of things. But it's very much her ideas about immigration that gets her, the popular vote. And I have to say that Macron's presidency has been very disappointing in that respect, because he came in as a centrist liberal president with a reformist agenda for France, bring France into the modern world. He's somebody who was under 40 when he became president of France, very much an international outlook, worked in finance, and yet his presidency has been marked and marred, dare I say, by, he still retains a provincial mindset. A very parochial mindset that actually allowed Marine Le Pen to flourish. She only had 2 MPs, and thanks to him, she has 89 MPs in Parliament now. So that's a huge jump, and that's because he pandered to her ideas and contributed to make them mainstream as well.
Thank you. Do you think that, obviously you said that there's a chance that she's come runner-up twice. She's only really increased her majority. So, as you mentioned, there's a chance that she might win in the next election, which would lead France going obviously completely far right. But I'm interested, obviously, given the current political climate and what's going on in Israel and Gaza, given that the far right and the National Front Party has a long history of anti-Semitism, but now campaigns on an Islamophobic platform, what kind of rhetoric are they producing about the kind of current crisis in the Middle East?
Well, one of the things I was absolutely staggered by is only a few weeks ago, the Marine Le Pen and her party took part in a march in central Paris against anti-Semitism. And that's a party that's literally steeped in anti-Semitism. Literally the history of the party is marked by anti-Semitism. The foundation of the party is based on anti-Semitism. I can't stress enough the number of members of the Waffen SS that were founding members of the party, including collaborationists And this legacy is still very, very strong in France. So it's an absolute insult to the Jewish community, to people who believe in, religious freedom, to allow her to parade in central Paris and pretend that she has an anti-Semitic, that her agenda is actually designed to protect Jews. It really isn't. I think she's slightly shifted her emphasis towards Islamophobia, but, one doesn't go without the other. If you have religious prejudice of any sort, don't be under any illusion. It applied the same police forces, for example, that were rounding up French Jews during the Second World War. Maurice Papon, who was prefect of Paris in the 1940s, literally rounding up 75,000 Jews during the Second World War, serving them on a plate using national means like nationalized railway stations to entrain them to their deaths in Nazi Germany. It was the same prefect who was massacring Algerians in France in the 1960s. Again, one of the great dangers that I identify in France is how mainstream her party has become, her ideas have become, including the ideas of people like Éric Zemmour, who was a presidential candidate at the last elections, who is even more to the far right than she is. Interestingly, he's of Jewish descent, and it didn't stop him to say that Pétain, the Pétain government during the Vichy regime during the Second World War, in fact, protected French Jews. Now, that's an absolute, inaccuracy of history, and he was able to get away with it. And this is also someone who had numerous criminal convictions for inciting racial hatred and religious hatred, and yet he was allowed to stand as a presidential candidate. Now, this is the kind of country we're talking about. It's absolutely frightening. If somebody came up with that kind of comments or indeed had criminal convictions against their names for inciting racial hatred or indeed religious hatred, they wouldn't be able to stand for elections in the first place, let alone given a chance to get in. And that's one of the biggest dangers I would identify in France today.
Well, we're going to come to questions from the audience in just a second. So if you have any questions about France today or its government or anything that we've discussed, then do get them ready now. But what I would ask is if someone was traveling to Paris, for example, and they had a little bit more time to kill, is there anywhere kind of outside of the normal tourist areas, potentially in one of these suburbs that we've discussed, that you think maybe they should travel to get a better sense of what Paris and what France is like today?
Well, I would say, and I think most of you would remember that during the summer there was a fatal shooting of teenagers, 17-year-old French teenager of Algerian and Moroccan background who was shot dead by police in Nanterre. And I would actually encourage people to go and see what it's like outside of Paris. It's technically an easy commute, but a 15-minute train journey takes actually a long time because transport, is, I would say, deliberately not straightforward to keep those communities outside of central Paris. You've got faster train linking Paris to Marseille than Paris to its suburbs. But it's interesting in many respects because it says a lot about modern France. Now, why Nanterre is an interesting place? It's because, as you might know, it was where the May 1968 revolution started. And in many people's perception, May 68 was revolutionized modern France. It was started by a group of students and in the brand new University of Nanterre, which was designed after American-style universities, and they were complaining about all sorts of things, from the war in Vietnam to having mixed dormitories. What they didn't complain about is the shanty towns of Algerians that were right next to the university. 10,000 Algerians who were living in bidonville, in shanty towns, with no water, no running water, no electricity, literally in metal barracks. And they were parked there because they were seen as dissidents within that could cause trouble. And interestingly, those shanty towns, those bidonvilles, are now replaced by tower blocks. Those tower blocks were designed by the architect Le Corbusier. It was based on a utopian project. And the idea was quite noble at the start. It was to build convenient housing that would host as many people as possible. In tower blocks, you would have greeneries at the bottom and parks where families and children can play. And as you go up and up and up, you get closer to blue skies and peace and calm and all that blue skies can represent. The reality is there were rabbit hutches, they were stuck outside the main cities, and they kept those communities apart from mainstream society. And not just in terms of accommodation, but also in terms of all sorts of opportunities. Those communities were not given, were discriminated against when it comes to job opportunities, when it comes to education, and it remains the case. So it was quite symbolic in a rather sinister way that moving on from the 60s up until today, that something like the shooting of a French-Algerian can still happen on those various states by an agent of the state, just as they were brutalized all those decades ago. And it just shows that the perception of those communities hasn't changed. They're still very much viewed as troublesome, as a problem, and very much treated in the same way. And unless, you know, those communities are brought into the mainstream, there will never be a cohesive France where everybody can live side by side, and where the motto of liberty, equality, and fraternity can truly and really apply. And it doesn't take much, again, it doesn't take another revolution. We've had that already, and we've got the principles that derive from it. We just need to apply them.
Awesome. Thank you very, very much. If you have a question, this is the moment to ask it. We will have a microphone for you. Yes. Someone who's been taking notes diligently. We love that. Go for it.
It helps me to keep track of what I hear.
Oh, fantastic. There'll be a test at the end, so it's very good.
I suppose this may well be one of the myths about France, but in my mind, I would say France has this very strong intellectual leftist tradition. And I just wondered whether you find allies and interesting resources around say Annie Arnaud or Le Monde Diplomatique or Pierre Bourdieu. Of course, he used to be more of a presence than since he died, but at least when he was very much on the side of the Algerians and doing the research there. And I'm just curious how it's felt now, and obviously by somebody like you who really cares about developing that.
No, that's a very pertinent question and a very good observation. France has a very strong left-wing tradition, and especially, as you mentioned, in relation to the Algerian war, there were, you know, scores of intellectuals, not least of all Simone de Beauvoir, for example, who campaigned relentlessly for Algeria to become independent and seek, self-determination. And to a certain extent, they contributed an awful lot to having the mood change in France and basically say, it's about time to let Algeria go. And this has influenced de Gaulle in many ways in becoming a bit more lenient towards the idea of, giving, not prosecuting, war in Algeria. And to a certain extent, it also led to de Gaulle's assassination attempts a number of times. Members of his own paramilitary, the organization of the secret organization, the organization of the OAS, the secret army organization, who were very determined to keep Algeria French, tried to assassinate him a number of times. You might be aware of superb movie called The Day of the Jackal that deals with that. And so there is this noble tradition of reform, and the French, I'm a child of the 80s, so I know all about François Mitterrand and its policies, and to a certain extent they pour a lot of money into those housing estates to make sure that young people don't remain idle. But, it's not the same thing just to pour money to keep, peace, if you like. And it's, dare I say, quite patronizing, because what anybody would like to do in any society is to be treated as an equal, not to be given crumbs or being looked after. Would like to think that members of society like to get up in the morning, get a good education, get a good job, and get on with things. And the French left at the moment is quite divided, to put it mildly. If you put all the left-wing trends together, they can easily win the presidency. A coalition of socialists, communists, Greens, and the likes, if they came together, it's a shoe-in, but they never get on, famously. It has to be said that François Hollande's presidency recently didn't help. He started off by with an extreme agenda, saying that he wanted to tax the rich up to 75%, which made a lot of people consider getting a passport, a foreign passport, including a Russian one, or anything else that would make their money safe abroad. But very early on, he brought in a finance minister, and guess who that was? Emmanuel Macron. And so it's completely split up the left. Macron very much implemented an agenda that was pro-business, and under his presidency it remains the case. It remains pro-business, and I think this tradition of the left is slightly waning. I think it's not a trend that's specific to France. I think we're seeing the rise of populist politics, parochial politics, nationalistic politics, and it's almost inward-looking. And invariably, this leads to stigmatizing the other, whoever that might be. And it's less prone to a society that looks after each other, basically.
Thank you very much. A great question. Oh, yes. Well, you've already got the microphone, so I suppose that makes sense. You've decided yourself. We'll come back to you others, don't worry, in just a second. Go for it.
Hi, Nabila. Thank you so much for depicting all the structural problems in France. But I'm just curious to know about your view on the creation of a sixth republic, because we know that the Fifth Republic is not working very well. So I'm just curious to know about your view on this, and if there is any kind of solution that we can think about.
that's something I actually argue for in my book. I think Sixth Republic, even as shorthand to, bring about a change of regime, would be very welcome. Not least of all because I highlighted how we currently have a presidential form of government with the possibility of a determined individual like Emmanuel Macron, who literally came from nowhere to win the presidency. France had very established political parties, the Gaullist right, the socialist left, and yet they both collapsed and allowed somebody like Macron, who admittedly branded himself as neither of the left, neither of the right, to come in. Purely by chance. He's quite moderate, quite a centrist, but just imagine if an extremist, a full-blown extremist got in. They could behave in the exact same manner, rule by decree, choose their own prime minister, choose even more extreme cabinet members, and pass any legislation they want, without even once having to go through parliament. So that's an absolutely terrifying prospect. And in that respect, I think the Fifth Republic is a completely out-of-date institution because it came in, as I said, at a time of emergency. France was on the brink of a civil war. Algerian nationalists wanted freedom. French patriots wanted to hang on to Algeria. And a strong man in the person of Charles de Gaulle was brought in. It was actually an autocratic way of ruling the country. He was given extraordinary powers, and the idea was, this is a time of emergency. We need the country to come together and ward off any threats from within. But 65 years on, that threat disappeared. And I think that the Fifth Republic is not fit for purpose any longer. We need to revert to a more parliamentary form of democracy. Now, some people would argue that, for example, the Fourth Republic that preceded the Fifth Republic was massively unstable. And it was, many dozens of governments in a short period, in 12 years' time. But I would argue that it was in the context, you have to look at the historical context of why things happened that way. For example, the Third Republic, which was also a parliamentary democracy, happened in the context of the Franco-Prussian War, for example. But I would contend that getting rid of a quasi-monarchical system is absolutely urgent and restore a more democratic form of government in the shape of the Sixth Republic, or call it something else, but certainly give parliamentarians a say, because that's what they're here for. They are literally here to represent the people. And it's often in the wake of a cataclysmic event that changes of the constitutional changes happen in France. The Franco-Prussian War for the Third Republic, the Algerian War of Independence in the case of the Fifth Republic. And it might be that the election of a far-right extremist next time around will be the trigger that will lead to a constitutional change. But I very much hope that it will happen before that, occurs.
Awesome. Thank you very, very much. Great question. Who else? Oh, if you could pass the microphone to someone else with the hand up, that would be fantastic. Oh, we'll come here. And then if are there any other questions, put your hand up if you've got a question. Perfect. Okay, we'll make this our last
Hi,
one.
thank you, Nabila. I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you.
I've been an immigrant 3 times with my very obviously mixed race family here in America and in France for about 14 years, actually. And our experience of those 3 countries was very, very different. And as immigrants, frankly, we felt extraordinarily comfortable in France. We feel okay here. And the US was a disaster. And I just wonder whether something that I've thought, and I'd be really interested in your perspective, is whether we demand too much of France. Because I found that the confidence of Americans about racial integration, about their political system, about social justice was very high. Our experience was different. Here I would say is a bit in the middle. And France, I found a lot of criticism. And actually I was thinking, this isn't too bad. So would you say we're too hard on France?
Would I say?
That we are too hard on France? We expect too much of France?
No, I would say we can certainly have very different experiences of France depending on who we are. And the basic argument I make in my book is that people like me certainly have a very different experience. Because I would contend that the legacy of colonialism is still very strong. So people from my background or people from North African background, certainly black and indeed Muslim, would have a very different experience from people like yourself.
My kids are black.
Yeah.
So
I
African
see.
black.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, Central African black. So yeah, I would agree.
And you've had a rather...
Well, in France, actually, I saw my my late husband, who was Southern European, looked Algerian, encountered much more racism than my two very, very dark-skinned children did. But it was interesting, I suppose, just and I absolutely take your point about the difference of experience. But I suppose what I'm interested in is whether we expect a lot from France. We expect France to be perfect.
No, I don't think we do, but I think France itself has set the bar very high indeed. It has impossible ideals to live up to, and for that reason, it's very difficult to meet all those ideals. There's nothing wrong with having, idealistic views, and there are certainly attempts to make them work, but I think France needs a dose of pragmatism. It needs to implement, all the legislation that it's already equipped with, to make life fairer for everyone, really. And to a certain degree, yes, it has to do with the color of your skin, your race and religion, not least of all because of the colonial legacy. I mean, France, had a vast empire, and in actual fact, when you look at discrimination in France, again, it's a matter of perception. Most of the time, and it's because it's conveyed by politicians, that you'd think that people who cause trouble in France or who cause problem are often depicted as immigrants and their descendants, immigrants from after the Second World War, who tended to be to come more from Africa, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, tended to be Muslim and have a darker skin color. And the perception is that they integrated far less than immigrants of the interwar period, who came mainly from Europe, are more fair-skinned, Catholic, of Catholic heritage. And in actual fact, when you look at all the sociological studies, and they all show unambiguously that it is the interwar wave of immigrants that integrated far less than the immigrants who came after the Second World War. And I would contend there's a very simple reason for that. It's because they were colonized by the French, so they could speak French. They knew the French up close, perhaps too close. And so they had a very good idea of what life would be like in France, and they integrated far better. For example, the rate of intermixed marriages is higher amongst immigrants, notably amongst Algerians who marry the most outside of their community. So it's all a matter of perceptions. And because they are disingenuously portrayed as a problem, they are given a harder time. But I would say that economic injustice and social injustice extends beyond those communities. It extends to a large section of French society, and it's to do with not just the model of governance, but also with the economic model, the French economic model. And I think, you know, if you look at France again on paper, you've got the two richest people on earth who are French, Bernard Arnault, head of LVMH, and Liliane Bettencourt, Myers, of the L'Oréal group. They're literally the two richest people in the world, and they're both Parisians. The problem is that, you know, they are in charge of companies that were created on inherited money. They literally cream off profits and, you know, and derive most of their fortunes from inherited money. The French economic model, it exports capitalism brilliantly to the rest of the world. There are magnificent French brands that do extremely well abroad. The problem is capitalism domestically, where it doesn't trickle down to most of French society. And that, to me, creates social inequality, it creates unrest. And I don't think it's too much to expect such a rich society in so many ways, not just financially, but also culturally. Let's not forget that France has exported a lot of, of the what other people, looked up to, the Enlightenment, human rights, and the rest of it. And I would like a return to that. I would like a return to those values that benefit us all.
Well, I think that's a great place to end on. Can we please give Nabila a huge round of applause?